Hey guys, this episode we're going to be walking through the pull request I just made to Request.js to add the query option to it. I just want to give you more examples of making open source contributions so that you can hopefully do more of them in the future yourself. So when I was working on the dynamic select with Hotwire episode for GoRails, I wrote a stimulus controller that uses Request.js, and it makes an AJAX request with some parameters in the URL. So when we select a country here like Andorra, it will make an AJAX request to the server, and if we pull up that list of requests, we'll see that it made this request here, states, and then it has country, AD, and a target in the URL. And those URL parameters are ones that I had to build up myself in the JavaScript and append to the URL. So let's take a look at that JavaScript. It looks like this. When the select box changes, it calls this function in stimulus. It creates a new URL search params object, which allows you to manage and add and remove and append URL parameters. And this just generates that query parameter string itself. So it doesn't generate the full URL, just that little portion. So we go ahead and we include that parameter. This case, it was called country. And we use the value of the selected option in that dropdown, in our case, Andorra's country code. And then we append the target so that Hotwire can update the correct field on the page. And then we make this URL that combines the URL and the parameters. And as I was using this, I realized it'd be nice if we could say this.URL value, and we could just pass in the query and pass in the params like so, and have that as an object that we could just add anything we wanted to. For example, target, and we could have this.select target.id and so on. So I thought it would be a good idea to add this query option to Request.js to simplify things. So what we're going to do is we're going to back up a little bit, and we're going to convert this to what I would ideally have for that example. So it would look like this. We'd have our URL value, we'd have our query, but this would be a variable, and we'd have our response kind, same as before. So let me just copy that line, and we'll paste this in. And we would create a query object here, and this would be target is this.select target ID, and then to dynamically put in this key name, we would say this.param value inside square brackets, and that would allow us to assign a dynamic key for our country because we wrote this to be reusable. And this is really what we would like this to look like. And so that is where I landed on this feature. I would love this to work like that. So I cloned the Request.js library to a folder, which you can see here, and I ran yarn link, and that's going to tell Yarn that you can link this package in any project, and it will create a symlink between them. I've already done that, which is why it gave us this warning, but we can go into our Rails application, and we can run yarn link at Rails request.js. What this will do is it will update your Yarn setup so that it will use your local copy of Request.js instead of the npm package that comes from npmjs.com. So this is super useful to allow us to work with local npm dependencies, and we can make modifications to those. So what's nice is we can say console.log hello from Request.js here. And if we made a change to trigger a recompile of Webpackers JavaScript, we'll see hello from Request.js. So we know that those are lined up, are symlinked together, and they're functional. We can start working on our refactoring of the fetch request options. So inside of options, we would pass that query, and we'd need to be able to convert that to a URL search params internally to fetch request. So my initial attempt here was to go down and say get query, and we would basically return new URL search params for this .options.query, and we just append that to the URL. And that would go up here, and we'd just rearrange this, and we'd say plus question mark plus this.query. And in theory, this works pretty well, except when you have query parameters on the URL already. We don't want to keep those, because if we appended 2 question marks on there, then I don't know what would happen by the Rails server or anything. So we wouldn't want duplicates. And also, if our query was empty, we don't want to include the question mark with nothing behind it. That would be weird as well. So this is a little bit too simple, a little bit too naive of an implementation. And so what we need to do instead is save the original URL that was passed in, and we need our query down here to actually parse those from that URL, and then add in all of the query options that exist in the options that were passed in. So we're going to go and modify this, and we're going to say const original query equals, and we're going to then take this original URL, we're going to split it on the question mark. We want everything on the right side of that, so that is the second value. So if we had, for example, several URLs that we need to support, no query options, one with foo as bar, we need to also support index with an anchor, and we'll put that one there. And actually we need this as well, so we need to support one with an anchor like that. So this is quite a bit. In our case, this first example with just index without a question mark, or the second one with an anchor without a question mark, this is going to return undefined, which is not good. So we want to set a default empty string there. And then we want to split this again, but this time on the hash symbol, and we want to grab everything before that. So what this will do is grab just the foo as bar portion of these URLs, and in these 2 cases, it will be an empty string. So that's going to get us a little bit further along, and then we can have the URL search params, take that original query, and then create a params variable out of it. So that's going to parse that string for us and handle all of that internally. And then we can say if this.options.query, then let's go through each one of those and we will append them to the params. So to do that, we have to use object.entries to iterate through each of the keys and values of this.options.query. And we can use a for loop to do this, but we're going to have to say const key is value to basically assign key and value and destructure that. And then we will have all of those that we need. So this is going to be a loop that just says params append key and value to the params. So that's good. We're going to take the original stuff, we're going to add in all the new stuff to it, create a single one with everything in it, and then we can return the query. But one of the troubles that we have to do is we want to keep that question mark only if there are query options in this params object. But there's not a really good way of checking that. It only has iterators. And so the best option that I found was to say const query equals params to string. We're going to convert that to the string object. And if there's nothing in it, it's an empty string. And we can return if query.length is greater than 0. We can say let's return question mark query. Otherwise, we're going to return an empty string. And so that's going to handle that so that we only include the question mark if it's actually needed. And then we need to have the window fetch still use this.url. And because we changed the name of the variable up here to original URL, we can write a method or a getter down below that will do the same thing. So we're going to add that. Let's do it right underneath query. And we'll say get URL. And this is going to return this.original URL split on the question mark, because remember, we don't want to keep any of the stuff after it because we are doing the parsing and combining of them. So we're going to grab everything before the question mark, and then we are going to add the query to it. So this will add either an empty string if there are none in the existing URL and the options, or if there are either one, it's going to include them or combine them. So with all of those things done, we now should be able to support both options. So we can make a request where get has some route with foo equals bar. And if we were to include query of a equals 1, then that should actually generate a request with foo equals bar and a equals 1. And that would be perfect. So now we can save this. We've made some changes. We should see the JavaScript recompile, but you might need to make sure that you do. So then we can basically look here and see, did we make any typos? Is everything correct? And so on. And you'll notice that we do have a typo here in our file. So we can go and look at that source code and see, okay, it looks to me like we have a typo on that for loop. So we'll go in there and we'll grab that line and we'll just double check and make sure that we have everything there. And that should be of object.entries. If we we'll go back over here, make a change, recompile our JavaScript, and we should now see that that works. So we have to be a little bit different with the compiling because the recompiling is not going to automatically notice that your node module has changed. So we needed to make just a little change inside of our JavaScript to have it recompile, and that triggers it. So now we can go and run this, and we can see that that is still working for those. We have our target and our country. It's a little bit different order now. And we can go through and make any adjustments we want to here, where we could say plus foo equals bar and refresh this. And you will see that when we change the country now, we're going to get foo and bar included in there in the param. So that works great. So now we're using both of those features. We can use one or the other. We could skip this and just keep it in the URL, and it's all going to work. So that's the solution that I submitted for the pull request that got merged. Now, along the way, I had a very simple version of this that just assumed that the URL would not include any query options in it. So we didn't have to go through this whole process of taking the existing stuff and parsing that. We could just go straight to actually creating a URL search params and appending it. But as Tony Drake pointed out in the comment on the PR, it's basically like, look, if there is one in there, it's going to duplicate the params on the URL, which is going to be weird. And that was enough to convince me that, like, you know, if the URL did have one, we should properly support that. It's not going to be good as a solution to tell users, hey, don't do that, because they would have to parse it out if they already just had a string with options in it. So it's much better for us to just take whatever you give us and parse that and then append onto it. Then the other thing that he pointed out was that we are going to be losing the anchor in our AJAX calls by doing this splitting. And I think that's okay, because typically the anchor isn't used for anything except for on the client side. It's often used for scrolling down to an ID on the page, and there isn't really a use that I know of on the server side. So I think it's safe to get rid of it in this case, but it is open for a PR in case that is useful for some reason, and someone wants to go and add that into the URL option there. So after that, the maintainer checked everything out and merged it and was good to go. So that will be included in the next version of this release. And I think the important thing to point out here is that, as Tony pointed out, you want it to work as expected. So if a user did something that you didn't expect, you want it to actually handle it nicely. And so in this case, you know, telling the users they can't include query parameters in their URL anymore would be weird, and so that makes sense that we would want to handle those things safely. So I think it's a much better way to do this, and a safer thing to include that extra bit of parsing. So that's it for this episode. That was just a fun example that I worked on this weekend that I thought would be useful, just to walk through the process and show you some more examples of contributing to open source so you can get involved as well. If you have any open source projects that you would like a review on your pull request, let me know in the comments or send me an email or tweet at me, and I would love to check out your code and give you a review. Maybe help you think about edge cases or refactor things. And yeah, sounds good. I will talk to you guys in the next episode.